Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming tonight. I'm Noreen Hersfeld, the Reuter Professor of Science and Religion here at St. John's in the College of St. Benedict. And for those of you who listen to public radio and looking at the audience, I'm guessing those are a lot of the people who are here. Our speaker tonight hardly needs any introduction. I'm sure you've heard him many times on Morning Edition and ClimateCast. But it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Seeley. Dr. Seeley is the former extension climatologist and a professor emeritus in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climatology at the University of Minnesota. At the U, Dr. Seeley managed the Weather and Climate Education program, as well as doing research and teaching. Dr. Seeley has also helped produce award-winning documentaries for TPT on Minnesota's most memorable historical weather events and on how climate change is affecting the state's infrastructure and natural resources. He's the author of Minnesota Weather Almanac and Wilderness in Minnesota's National Park, an award-winning book on our one and only national park. Dr. Seeley has received a variety of awards, including the Minnesota Crop Production Retailers Association Outstanding Service Award, the Minnesota Agri-Growth Council Distinguished Service Award, the Seal Prize in Agriculture, the University President's Award for Outstanding Community Service, and the University of Minnesota Extension Deans and Directors Award, and he even got an award from MnDOT for his work on designing snow fences. Tonight's talk is sponsored by the Nicholas and Bernice Reuter Professorship in Religion and Science and by St. John's School of Theology through a grant from the Science in the Seminaries program of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Mark Seeley.
Thank you, Noreen, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been on your campus two other occasions in my life, having attended a wedding here a few years ago, but also having lectured your students and faculty, I think in 2017 or 2018. I need to preliminarily say a few quick things. Since I know she's going to ask me when I get back to St. Paul about how many people were here, how many people listen regularly to NPR? Oh, good. Kathy Werzer will be so pleased. I am going to present tonight a little different than most presentations, in that you're going to hear from Mark Seeley, the scientist, but you're also just going to hear from Mark Seeley, the citizen, or Mark Seeley, the fellow Minnesotan. Bluntly, I hope to personalize a few things this evening, because I think in the context that we've communicated back and forth, I think the mission tonight is a little bit more along the personal lines for me. I am not Catholic. I was baptized in the Methodist Church as a youngster. I have been a practicing Methodist all of my life, as has my wife. And I will share some faith perspectives from that context as we get later into the presentation. I will try to do the best I can and get through my presentation, and then I hope we will have time at the end for a little Q&A. I realize that you're not here to go past, I don't know, what shall we say? Certainly not too much past 9 or 9:15, right? I think I'm stretching it. So I'll go ahead and get started here. By the way, as a climatologist, I always say this as an introduction because I've been a lifelong professional meteorologist and a lifelong professional climatologist. And I find that as a speaker, I get a lot more respect as a climatologist. Because at least to date, I've never gotten yesterday's weather wrong. So anyway, we'll go ahead and start here. First off, I want to acknowledge Collegeville is a wonderful resource for climatologists in that it represents a deep climate history for Stearns County. And as many of you know, your records go back to October of 1892 with a gap during World War II, but otherwise your service to this greater community here in central Minnesota has been remarkable. Now, there have been a number of people over the years responsible for those measurements, and I don't have the long list of names with me, but it's kind of an interesting record. These are just some of the climate facts that can be drawn from that long historical record that goes back to 1892. Probably some of you are acquainted with these records from your own observations here at Collegeville. The last one is rather interesting in that I can tell you this: master gardeners, of which we have thousands in Minnesota, and farmers are paying a lot of attention to our growing season. And again, according to your records right here in Stearns County, that last point, that your frost-free growing season has gone from 151 days to 162 days. And so that's another marker. We see, as we study, by the way, we have over 200, Collegeville is but one, we have over 200 local climate histories in our state database. And as we study across the breadth of that database, including all 87 counties, we find that the season length, the growing season length in Minnesota, thanks to climate change, has changed anywhere from 9 days to as much as 22 days. So we've really seen that play out in our lifetimes. I divided what I'm going to talk about into segments. Of course, bear in mind you're dealing with a personality here that's used to a 5-minute segment on radio, so I'm going to try to maintain some continuity that's a little longer than 5 minutes here. But I'm going to talk first about evidence of climate change in our own backyards, which is using the Minnesota data, which I was a caretaker of throughout my career, so I know Minnesota's data about as well as anybody. I'm going to use that as evidence. I'm going to talk about dimensions of community response because I've worked with emergency management and the National Weather Service and FEMA and others over my career, and I've seen a lot of traumatized Minnesota communities trying to recover from weather and climate trauma in my life, and how people have coped with that. Then I'm going to share stewardship and faith perspectives, and then I'm going to talk about a program that I helped start back in 2007 that you may not be aware of, called the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership, which is working to help all Minnesota communities and citizens adapt and become more resilient to the pace of climate change that's going on in our lifetime. First off, for context, Minnesota became a state in 1858. We, in the late 19th and early 20th century, thanks to some Eastern USA writers, became known as the American Siberia. Not exactly a great marketing marker, the American Siberia. It was realistic in the sense that we sampled the weather and climate here in Minnesota, especially back in the 19th century and parts of the 20th century. And all those markers, all those measurements did show that we had a climate that behaved similarly to Siberia. We've no doubt that's been dampened off a little bit in our lifetime, but we still sample real extremes. I would remind you of Groundhog's Day 1996. On Groundhog's Day 1996, we had minus 60 degrees at Tower, Minnesota, up in St. Louis County. Poor Kathleen Hoppe, who was our longtime weather observer there, had 2 helicopters parked on her front lawn, and I don't know how many buses, because all the media in the state knew we were going to be setting a new statewide record that morning. And Kathleen Hoppe, God bless her, she's now a Canadian citizen. She and her husband were caretakers of that tower data set for many decades, and she was a very private person. She didn't like all the fuss. So after that event took place, she and her husband decided they didn't want to be weather observers anymore, and so they moved to Canada. But be that as it may, I might further add that, Groundhog's Day, February 2nd, 1996, Kathleen Hoppe's thermometer read -60, which remains to this date the coldest temperature ever measured in our environs here. And 2 days later, in fact, less than that, 36 hours later, she was 48 plus. So 108 degree temperature difference in 36 hours. Unbelievable. Well, anyway, I just wanted, with the wide variation in the American Siberia, I want to emphasize one point as a scientist. It is hard to decipher a climate change signal, a meaningful climate change signal, when your measurements historically show so much variability. It's like signal versus noise, the classic signal versus noise dilemma in science is how do you decipher a signal out of all that statistical noise? And that's really, for me at least, the first 2 decades I worked in Minnesota, I was wrestling with that one. The other marker about the American Siberia is people, make fun of us having lived with that label for several decades, but at least it wasn't the same label as South Dakota, which lived for decades with the label the blizzard state. So anyway, showing that variability is really, really easy, because if you tap our Minnesota State Climate Database and you look at any single calendar date on the calendar, you can find what Mother Nature has brought us in history. So here we are meeting with each other on October 9th. Historically, in October 9 of 2010, it was 92 degrees while they were harvesting corn out in Redwood Falls, in Redwood County, Minnesota. Back in 2000, in St. Louis County, up at Embarrass, it was 10 degrees. October 9th, 1973, up in Itasca County at Grand Rapids, they were having a nearly 4.5-inch thunderstorm rain with cloud tops to 48,000 feet, just as if it was July 9th instead of October 9th. And then back in 1970 at Slayton, Minnesota, down in southwestern Minnesota in Murray County, they were getting 7.5 inches of snow on the corn crop that hadn't been taken out of the field yet. So Mother Nature's roll of the dice, now bear in mind this is October 9, so we have the same sunrise and sunset every year. We have the same sun angle over Minnesota every year, and yet look what the environmental conditions can bring us. That's a marker of our variability. And speaking of variability, in my discipline, climate science, there's a very famous paper that came out in the 80s by Stan Chagnon, a very, very famous climate scientist from the University of Illinois, widely decorated by the American Meteorological Society. And he looked at the statistical nature of climate behavior throughout American history. And I'm showing you a graphic from his famous paper back then, where he shows how we perceive climate behavior in a graphical context. So the top graph there, which is labeled the stationary view of climate behavior, is fundamentally what Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and many others of our founding fathers, who were, by the way, daily weather observers in their time, what they believed. And what that belief was, that if you sampled the climate at a geographic point, day after day, month after month, season after season, that over the course of time, you would be able to decipher its seasonal behavior, its day-to-day and monthly behavior. And you could describe that with central means, what we call the central mean character, the horizontal line through that graphic. And then the wavy line throughout would be the year-to-year variability associated with that time of year. But that it was stationary. In other words, you'd get a mean value with kind of a stationary variability about that mean, and you'd have all the information you needed to know about that location, and you could design your life around that in terms of water supply and soils and crops and a whole host of other things. Later in the course of our development in this country, we came up with the variability view of climate behavior, which is a modification of the stationary view, which suggests that, yes, we can define the climate of a given location statistically with its mean and maybe standard deviations or variability, but what we find across the longer course of time, going, say, from decades to centuries, is that the variability about the mean values waxes and wanes in the context that some years you get stuck in a rut, so one year's like the next, like the next, like the next, or sometimes you go through eras of time where it's distinctly different. And so one year is not a good predictor of what the next year is going to bring, and you get this wide-ranging variability. And then in our lifetime, climate perception finally shifted to what's called the climate trend view, which is that, as you can see on the bottom graph, especially on the left side, that you may go along in supposedly a stable climate mode for a given geographic location, where using the historical means and variations to plan how you're going to manage your water resources, how you're going to manage your electric utility grid, how you're going to manage your transportation system, how you're going to manage your food system, etc. And you've got some stability to all those numbers, but then all of a sudden you go into wild measurements that are outside the range of the historical population. And that's exactly the era that we're in. And I'll show you the examples of that in Minnesota. We are more and more in Minnesota, with each passing year, we are measuring an attribute of the climate of Minnesota that we have no previous measurement of. And this is what's scary. I talked about this afternoon with some of your faculty. And this is an important word to remember. If you don't remember any other word from tonight's presentation, please remember this word, PACE, P-A-C-E. It's the pace of climate change that is the most disconcerting factor that we're dealing with. Because now, over the course of decades, we're measuring changes in our climate behavior that used to take thousands of years to occur. And how in the world are we going to keep up with this? There is geographic disparity across our country. We happen to live in a piece of real estate in the northern plains and in the Great Lakes region that is undergoing some of the most profound climate change. This is a depiction from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration of the net change in mean annual temperature over the last century or more. The coloration is simply that the yellows and orange are a relatively minor or moderate change in mean annual temperature, whereas the reds are a very significant change in mean annual temperature. You can see how red it is over our state. And even within our state, we have a gradient, don't we? From the Iowa border to the Canadian border, we have a gradient that operates across our state that says, with respect to the temperature attribute, the temperature is changing more at a faster pace in the northern part of our state than it is in the southern part of the state. Similarly, we have a disparity across our country in terms of the net change in mean annual precipitation from the same derived data set over a century of data. All the green is showing areas where the precipitation has increased. The mean annual precipitation has increased. And you'll note out in the desert Southwest, I was a member of the American Association of State Climatologists for about 30 years, and my dear friend out there in Arizona, who was the state climatologist, was trying to tell the legislative lawmakers in Arizona that the climate was changing, and now after 27 consecutive years of drought, they're finally believing her. Only took 27 years. Another marker of this that we can find in evidence in the Minnesota data is if we simply on a plot, we plot the mean annual temperature and the mean statewide precipitation as a single data point on a graphic. And that's what's done here by Dr. Kenny Blumenfeld, the senior climatologist in the Minnesota State Climatology Office, a former student and colleague of mine. What's depicted here, back to 1895, is the mean annual temperature is on the horizontal scale, the scale that runs left to right, and the mean annual precipitation on a statewide basis is on the vertical scale that runs from bottom to top. Notice the coloration. Each data point since 1987 is colored differently, and the reason for that is historically an argument could be made statistically that our history up till 1987 had exhibited somewhat of a random distribution. We had about as many cool, wet years as warm, dry years, or however you want to frame it. But since 1987, as you can see from the displacement of the data points, all marked in red, we've seen a pronounced shift to the right, which is higher temperature, and a pronounced shift to the top of the page, which is wetter precipitation. And 2019, marking the very top center of the graphic, remains our wettest year in history, when all 1,500 weather observers in the state of Minnesota averaged out for the year 2019 over 35 inches of precipitation, which was absolutely remarkable in the context of what our history showed. Here's a depiction somewhat similar that I did for the Collegeville data, where I've simply shown graphically the historical distribution of year-by-year precipitation in the green bars, and then the lines track the year-by-year mean annual temperature. And it doesn't take a great deal of perceptive ability to see that the right-hand side of your graphic here in Collegeville is very much elevated over what the left-hand side was. I don't have a trend line through that. I was loath to do that because of the gap in the data during World War II, but somebody could run that probably, I'm sure, and see what the upward slope is with respect to precipitation and temperature. Another unique attribute of the Minnesota evidence for climate change is to simply look at the net change in monthly mean values of our temperature and look at it with a bar graph and discriminate between the monthly change in our maximum temperature and the monthly change in our minimum. We happen to occupy a piece of real estate in North America where the minimum temperatures are changing at twice the pace of the maximum temperatures. So you'll note on this graphic, the net change in the minimum monthly temperatures is in blue, and the net change in the mean monthly maximum temperatures is in red. You will also note there's a seasonal disparity in that the winter season, the season of long nights and short days, shows the largest magnitude of change in our geography. Now, a lot of this, rather from a common sense standpoint as well as a scientific standpoint, is all about the presence or absence of snow cover. We've lost the continuity of snow cover that Minnesota was once known for. What I mean by that is in our predecessors' time, if we go back to, say, our grandparents' time in Minnesota, first snowfall was typically in November. First snow cover was established by Thanksgiving time, and that snow cover persisted through usually to Easter time. And you could count on that. If you were doing things in the outdoors, you could count on persistently having snow cover during that interval. That is no longer the case, except for maybe the northern third of the state of Minnesota. It is disrupted frequently by warm spells in the winter, and we lose the snow cover entirely. Last winter, for example, our non-winter of last winter, we didn't even have soil frost. There were some agricultural measurements of soil frost last year that showed the maximum penetration of soil frost last winter, even in the most exposed landscapes, was only 1 or 2 inches. Essentially, our soils remained thawed all of last winter. And it was the first winter, at least in my lifetime in Minnesota, that we had golf courses open every month of the year. So some people applaud that, but that's a sign of the changing times. The other thing is about my authorship for the Minnesota Historical Society. I'm the author of Minnesota's history books about its weather and climate history. I published the first version of the Minnesota Weather Almanac back in 2006, which was a complete compilation of all the weather events and episodes and all the statistics from, it even predates the establishment of Fort Snelling, because we had some old weather records from the Northwest Fur Trade Company up in the Red River Valley that started in 1806. And anyway, that book was well received. It was nominated for a Minnesota Book Award, and then the Minnesota Historical Society came along and started worrying about me retiring, justifiably so, and they asked me to revise it. So I spent 2 years to revise it, and I published the second edition in 2015. The reason I bring that up is I had to update the second edition. Obviously, they wanted everything in there, all the statistics and everything updated. And what I found was that in the 9 years between the editions of these 2 books, within the Minnesota Climate Observing Network, we had set over 17,000 new daily climate records. Now that's a pace of change unmatched in our previous history. We also set 165 new all-time state records whereby we measured something in the environment we had no historical record of ever measuring. For example, the 15-inch rainfall we got in southeastern Minnesota on August 19th of 2007 that almost destroyed the town of Rushford. You probably remember the headlines about that. I think I made the comment to the faculty this afternoon. Sometimes the data that a scientist works with literally jumps off the page and slaps you in the face to get your attention. And that's exactly what was happening to me. I was seeing numbers that just did not make sense in the Minnesota climate context. More and more and more and more of these numbers. So, back to some data. There's our mean annual temperature curve. All you have to do is look at the right-hand side of the curve to see how many warm years we've been experiencing in our lifetime. It's a remarkable number. You can see the trend line, the blue line that runs through that. This is a very similar graphic, I might add, for whether you're looking at North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Manitoba, Ontario. If you look at all the mid-geography of the North American continent, you're going to find a graphic very, very similar to this. If you look at central China on the Asian continent, you're going to find a graphic very similar to this. So we are not experiencing this pace of change uniquely. There are other geographies experiencing this pace of change as well. And then here's a listing of the 20 warmest years in state history. And as you scan the left side of that to go down through the years, from 1987 at the top down to 1973 at the bottom, you will note a tremendous number of these years are in our lifetime. So that's how the distribution looks. The other marker here is if we seasonally dissect the historical data in our state of Minnesota, we find that the long-term temperature trend is up in all 4 seasons of the year. And as I stated earlier, it's most magnificently up in the winter season. The winter season has changed remarkably. We now have individual locations: Chippewa County, Lac-qui-Parle County, Swift County, Stevens County, Polk County, Clay County, Redwood County, Pipestone County, where the winter temperatures have changed in our lifetime by 7, 8, or 9 degrees. This is a remarkable pace of change. Compounding that a little bit, and this is an area that I kind of spearheaded the latter part of my career and is still going on a little bit more, is that the water vapor content of our atmosphere is changing over Minnesota, and we are more and more experiencing, for lack of a better descriptor, very uncomfortable and stress-inducing dew points, where the water vapor laden in the atmosphere is really high. It's up around 70, 75, 80 degrees, something like that, more like Cancun, Mexico, down on the Gulf, rather than up here in the middle of the North American continent. As a result, the National Weather Service, if you study the history of the National Weather Service in Minnesota, they're having to release more frequent heat advisories and excessive heat warnings, not because the air temperature is going to be forecasted to be 105 or 110, but because we're going to have a 90-degree air temperature with an 80-degree dew point, and therefore we're going to feel like 117 or 119 or something like that. So all the red years listed there where we've had documented heat waves, those are documented heat waves mostly because of the high water vapor content in the atmosphere, not because the air temperature has run away from us. In fact, one of our most remarkable was 2011, July 19 and 20 of 2011, where we had all kinds of record heat index values across our state and right through the midsection of the country. And the NOAA, National Weather Service Extremes Committee, for fully a year, I think it took a full year for this data to be certified by the National Weather Service, because they didn't believe it could be 134 heat index in Moorhead, Minnesota. But they finally proved through validation studies that from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. on July 19th, that's exactly what the heat index was in Moorhead, Minnesota. Which, as a reminder, that's the highest heat index that Furnace Creek Death Valley has ever measured. And here we're talking about Moorhead, Minnesota. And then, of course, even last year, just before the state fair, August 21 to 23 of 2011, we had that heat wave that it kind of scared everybody off about going to the state fair because it was so darn hot. And again, it wasn't because the air temperature, it was because the dew point or the water vapor content was so high. Another attribute commonly talked about in the context of climate change is the changing precipitation. And of course, that's changed dramatically in Minnesota over the years. There is a period of normals, a 30-year normals listed by the National Weather Service in the graphic in front of you, that shows through coloration the net change that's occurred over the Minnesota landscape. Once upon a time, annual rainfall values of 29 inches or greater were kind of confined to southeastern Minnesota. Now today, it's more or less half the state that is encompassed by that. And so the modern map that we use is the map that looks like this. And those values just keep going up and up. In fact, I mentioned earlier, we have over 200 local climate histories in the state of Minnesota. And if we look at what's happened over the last 100 years or so, we find that among those 200 climate histories, the overall change in annual precipitation has been anywhere from 10 to 40%. So we do have disparity in our own state, where in some cases it's been as low as 10%, but in other cases it's been as much as 40%, which is pretty remarkable. And there's the graphic of all observations across the history of time, and again you can see it's upward with most of the extremely wet years on the right side of that graphic, and the upward trend. And again, I would show you the list of the 20 wettest years historically in Minnesota based on all observations and the average for the state landscape. And there's the marker I mentioned earlier of the year 2019 with 35.5 inches from all observations. And again, for looking at context for when is this occurring, it's mostly in our lifetime. It's mostly occurring in our lifetime. And again, we have upward trends in all 4 seasons of the year. So if we look, even if we dissect your Collegeville data here, we look at the normals, annual precipitation normals at Collegeville go back to the 1921 to 1950 derived National Weather Service normals, and then we step through time and we look at the 1991 to 2020, which we're using currently for frame of reference. And it's a 38% increase. Pretty remarkable, even for right here. Grand Rapids is a little bit less, it's 24%. Now, one of the features that's been studied nationally, and Minnesota falls into this situation where a lot of these national studies are emphatic in certain states, and Minnesota happens to be one where the National Hydrology staff at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, along with the American Association of State Climatologists, they studied the frequency of what we call these mega rainfalls, where we have 1,000 square miles or greater blanketed by a 6-inch 24-hour rainfall. And we've been starting to see these with much greater frequency than any time in our state history. And the disturbing feature for us Minnesota citizens is they don't seem to have any preferred geography. They can occur in almost any part of the state. Lake of the Woods, western Minnesota, southeastern Minnesota, south central Minnesota. Anyway, and of course they're devastating. The consequence of these are very, very devastating. And this was further documented by a famous paper by Dr. Kevin Trenberth of the National Center for Atmospheric Research, who showed that Minnesota was among the states where not only is the long-term trajectory of Minnesota's annual precipitation upward, that's a given, like it is in so many states, the contribution of big dose rainfall events is upward, is occurring with higher frequency. So now we see the 4-inch rain with greater frequency, or the 6-inch rain with greater frequency, or things of that nature. And actually, there's a great controversy within the American Meteorological Society right now that asks the question, for hydrologic design, culverts, storm sewer runoff systems, farmers' tile drainage, any number of other hydrologic considerations, how often should the hydrologic design manual be updated? Because the frequency statistics of these high-dose events is changing so fast that now there's a movement afoot that we might need to update these every 10 years to get a handle on this. So anyway, consequences. Lots of stuff going on. We are seeing shifts in cropping systems. We're seeing a lot of attention to soil health and continuous crop coverage on our soils to protect our soils. We're seeing the Minnesota Landscape Association is, shall I say, delighted. One aspect of climate change they're somewhat delighted with is that the plant hardiness zones in the state of Minnesota are changing, so they can market landscaping plants that formerly couldn't be marketed in the state of Minnesota. So now, for example, I have a Forella, which is a zone 5A. I have a Forella pear tree in my backyard, and it's doing just fine, thank you. But I mean, there's a lot of things that are starting to be used in Minnesota that formerly were not adapted to this climate. Lots of hydrologic adjustment. The Minnesota Association, in fact, this might be an idea for you, Noreen, with this program development you're thinking of. Sometime you might want to consider the president of the Minnesota Floodplain Managers Association. They're doing wonderful work in the state of Minnesota in terms of mitigating situations where we have risk properties on floodplains, because it's getting harder and harder. You know, we have a situation in Minnesota where we have 2 flood threats. This isn't true in all states. We consistently, in the months of March and April, in selected years, we have a spring snowmelt flood threat. And then equally, in the May through September thunderstorm season, we have the threat of flash flooding. And believe me, those need to be approached in different ways. Those are different animals, is what I'm saying. But we've got a lot of work to do in terms of trying to adapt to and help mitigate flood threats in our state. And then, of course, the whole area of public health. The Mayo Clinic, I can't remember what decade it was. Some of you might be more familiar with this than me. I think it was in the 1990s that the Mayo Clinic formed a 21-physician team to study the implications of climate change on public health. And they first began to look at the allergy season, and then they began to look at all kinds of other things. And I'm not sure where they are. In fact, that committee's turned over since the 1990s, so I'm not sure I even know the same doctor names that I used to know back in the 90s. And then, of course, we've had tremendous modifications in crop insurance. Well, we've had modifications in insurance, period. The insurance industry is just, well, for example, my son owns his own insurance company in White Bear Lake, Minnesota. He's been in insurance for about 20 years. In August of 2023, I believe it was August 19th of 2023, for the first time in Minnesota history, we had over $1 billion in insured loss filed for a single swath of hail that crossed the state. August 19th, 2023. That's the first time that a hail loss in Minnesota has been a documented over $1 billion consequence. So we've got all kinds of things going on. This is not even a comprehensive list. This is just a few things that I've had a hand in addressing over the years. I'd like to shift gears a little bit in terms of, I mentioned earlier that in the course of my career, I did a lot of aftermath community meetings, either because of tornadoes, floods, droughts, a variety of things, both with state officials, government officials, bankers, insurance officials, FEMA officials, and others. I wasn't there because I was going to serve as a mouthpiece, although I did have to serve as a mouthpiece to document the nature of the weather trauma in terms of what we measured. That was my minor role. I was a minor player in all those community meetings, usually just sitting over on the sideline with a bunch of statistics on my lap. But the dialogue taught me a ton. It taught me a ton about community engagement on traumatic weather and climate issues. And some of the dimensions that I've listed here remain to this day really important to me. You have the cognitive dimension, which is that you have an audience of community citizens with variable knowledge and understanding about what weather and climate are really about and what they can do. You have an emotional dimension to the same community audience because you have people that for the first time in their lives are experiencing this trauma. And so their perception of risk associated with the tornado that just hit them last weekend is forever going to be changed. It's forever in their mind going to be changed because of what they lived through. You have the ethical side or dimension to this, which is arguably both moral and spiritual. You have what people think about in terms of ethics and dealing with risk from an ethical perspective and what that means. And then, of course, it's all colored, at least in our lifetime. I don't know that there's a lot made about context, and context of our lifetime is we're swamped with divisiveness. I think we have had divisive times in our country, but this one, with respect to understanding weather and climate risks, is extremely irritating, to say the least. And it's political. So you do have a political, you need to understand what the political bent is in your community audience, because it's going to have a bearing on what you can accomplish and really what your realistic expectations should be. So the reason I show this slide is because experience has taught me that all of these are important when you're meeting with a community. They all need some form of consideration and acknowledgement. And that's a lesson I didn't get academically. That's just a lesson from experience and going through what for me was really some very, very challenging community meetings. And we shouldn't neglect that dialogue. Now, a lot of scientists, and I think this argument was made by some of my colleagues I grew up in the science discipline with, they didn't want to touch the moral and spiritual aspects of the science they were doing. That was the furthest thing from they would walk away from any such engagement. And I was admitting to your faculty earlier today, I fell in that category until I was at least in my mid-40s. And I finally realized that, there's some leverage that you can gain with your dialogue if you're willing to deal with these sensitive topics. There's some persuasive leverage you can gain. People see that you're a human being, for crying out loud. They see where you're coming from, what's important to you, what you think about. And so that's something that I think more and more climate scientists are starting to acknowledge. And certainly there's some absolutely outstanding ones out there. In fact, one of the most outstanding is Dr. Catherine Hayhoe. Have you read any of her books? She deals with this head on. And there's other authors out there now that are doing this sort of thing. And of course, even to the most conservative of us, there's certain common ground here to share in terms of our history. Our Minnesota population, since statehood in 1858, we've dealt with a lot of challenging environmental issues. It hasn't been an easy task. There's been a lot of things that have provoked a lot of controversy and a lot of contentiousness. And there's some lessons out there we can learn from. And but one of the innate values I think we share as Minnesotans, besides loving the weather, of course, is we would like to conserve and preserve the state of Minnesota that we've lived with and loved all of our lives. I don't think there's a single Minnesotan that wouldn't want that to happen. And that's common ground for dialogue, okay? There's a common starting point that we can talk about with that. And then, of course, fundamentally, we also have what is becoming more and more of a subdiscipline of climate science, which is climate justice. Because just as the climate is changing across the world at a differential pace, and different attributes in different locations are changing at a distinctly different pace, the vulnerability of certain populations is hugely disparate. And we know a lot of cultures and people are going to get hammered maybe into extinction, or at least in terms of displacement, where they're going to have to find a new home. And this is something that we need to pay more and more attention to, because we're stewards, for crying out loud. Stewardship is a ethic for most of us, and for those of us that are religious, or at least for most of the world's religions, it's a mandate. And in that context, back in 2017, I'm going to refer now to one of the handouts that you have. Back in 2017, the National Adaptation Forum chose Minnesota to host its biennial conference. And it was down at the St. Paul River Center. And we had over 1,600 citizens from all 50 states attend this meeting. How many of you know who Paul Douglas is? Okay. He's also my friend. Paul and I put together, for the first time at a national adaptation forum, a faith-based session. And it was very, very, very well received. We had religious leaders across the board. It's there in your handout. It was a robust discussion of faith perspectives on the science of climate change. Had a little bit of a lot of dialogue, and we had some debate. The audience was fully engaged. And the people we invited to come and speak were so driven by that, emotionally and intellectually, that they conspired the next day with our encouragement, with encouragement from Paul and I, to draft their own statement from the presentations and discussions. And so I put that in your hands because it was very, very well received and might provoke us to think a little bit more seriously about engaging others that are maybe outside our community or maybe outside our own faith, but still engage them on this topic because there's a lot of common ground there. We have all kinds of community level response going on. A lot of church communities in our state have made intentional moves in terms of looking at their energy use, looking at their food waste, doing all kinds of things to their overall carbon footprint, their water use, a whole range of things, trying to showcase that they can be better stewards as a religious community. And we also have, in a broader context, we have this accountability situation, which I think weighs on a lot of people. We talked a little bit this afternoon in our faculty meeting. UC Berkeley, for example, it was announced today that in their undergraduate curriculum, they're going to offer a course for undergraduate students on mechanisms to cope emotionally with climate change, because it's become so disruptive, almost like an anxiety disorder. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see more institutions of higher learning begin to offer something like that in their curriculum. And the accountability, I think, weighs on, I don't know how many of you are acquainted with people that seriously think, almost on a daily basis, they seriously think about all these things in practice. It's a daily practice. How much water am I using? Okay. What am I eating today? Where does this come from that I'm eating? What went into this? How am I getting around today? Am I using the bicycle? Am I using public transportation? Am I using the electric car? What am I doing? And so the accountability aspect of our lives is resonating, especially, my perception is it's resonating prolifically with the younger generation as I see that happening. Now for me, my faith, as I mentioned earlier, is Methodism. John Wesley was the founder of the Methodist movement in England back in the 18th century. He attended Oxford in the 18th century, and he didn't overlap the formation of the Radcliffe Observatory, but he was at the time at Oxford during when natural philosophy and the natural world was becoming more commonly studied. And so he developed a love for science. I mean, they didn't even call it science back then, but that's what he developed. And he wrote about science. He wrote about the natural world. He was a daily, he was noted in it throughout his life for writing in a daily diary about the marvels of nature and the marvels of the world that God, he felt, asked us to look after. And that resonated with me as both a Methodist and a scientist. And I think that's what drives me to not be reluctant, if that's the right word, to talk about my own faith. I've given the Wesley lecture to many, I don't know, probably 200 churches throughout the state of Minnesota now. That's what drives me in terms of merging my faith as a driver with my science as a driver to do something about climate change. I wanted to get to the where is it? Oh, that's when he was writing about. He wrote scientifically about electricity, about lightning. In fact, he and Benjamin Franklin were mutual admirers. And then he also wrote about human health and nutrition. And then he also, and this is true today, we still have Sunday school classes about the Wesley quadrilateral, which is depicted, oh no, I didn't put it up yet. It's depicted in this graphic, which is as we live the Christian life, and as we cope with new knowledge, as we cope with new challenges, as we cope day to day throughout our lives with questions like, am I doing the right thing? Am I treating this person in the right way? Am I making this decision correctly? Am I prioritizing the right things? All of these very important questions in your life that in the tradition of using the Methodist quadrilateral, you bring into play scripture, tradition, experience, and reason or knowledge. And that those dimensions all come to bear on the things you do, the decisions you make in your daily life. And it's really not, for me, as a 78-year-old senior, I'll tell you, it hasn't worked out too badly for me. It seems to have become my anchor. And so that is what's worked for me. Now, there's a lot of interesting things I could go on to say, but I'm going to bring this to an end. Let's find a way to keep our home, planet Earth, safe and healthy. All religions provide pathways for us to better understand our relationship to God and His creation. God speaks to us through His creation. God's creation is better understood through science and new knowledge. You can merge those things. Those things aren't antithetical, like maybe some of our political leaders have that bent. God gave us the capacity to learn and gain new knowledge, and I believe that it was His intent for us to use that. And so in that context, one area that I would encourage your group here to become involved with is the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership Program. We founded this program in 2007. It has state, federal, and NGO funding. It's got 13 full-time staff working across the state in various subdisciplines: housing, transportation, agriculture, energy, hydrology, a whole range of things, to try to help individuals and communities strategize and cope best with our rapidly changing climate. It is a much needed program. There's other states like Oregon, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, California that are actually following Minnesota in this. We're leading. I thought we were just supposed to be above average, but we're actually in this arena, we're leading. We set something out there that other states are following. It's magnificently led by a faculty member named Dr. Heidi Roop, who is currently on loan to the White House as the Chief Climate and Science Advisor to President Biden's administration. We're keeping our fingers crossed that she'll come back to the University of Minnesota after the election, but we don't know that for sure. But anyway, this is an organization that has a theological bent to it. It's presented at a number of churches around the state, as well as other universities and campuses. And I would encourage you to get or think about that. Some of the things they're doing. Let me get to that here. If there's a list, yeah, here it is. Some of the things they've done, at least in the last several years, are listed here. And I think these would be, well, there's a lot of different things you could plug into here that might be helpful. Pragmatic kinds of things. And, fundamentally, all of us role model our attitude towards God's creation. Whether we speak about it, we role model it in our daily lives and our actions. And it should not be underestimated that that has influence. I mean, granted, we all are, shall we say, influential with our families, our neighbors, our relatives, our church, our clubs, etc. And the very minimum you can do is role model your respect and love for creation. And that's fundamentally, I think, a Minnesota attribute. I've never lived in a state that exhibits this more than the state of Minnesota, and I've lived in 13 states. So I would like to stress that. And for those that would like to pursue and upgrade their knowledge about climate science and climate change, the American Meteorological Society has in play, and it's in Minnesota, it's in play in Minnesota, an online education program that educators can enroll in called DataStream that teaches climate science and atmospheric science. And for those of you that want to upgrade or improve your knowledge in this arena, your knowledge and understanding, I would emphasize to you that you might want to contact this group and enroll. I think they meet, oh boy, I'm trying to think. I think it involves, time-wise, it's all online, as so many of these courses are. It's all online, and I think there's 4 required meetings through the course of the semester, and they're all on Saturdays. So you got to block 4 Saturdays over the course of the semester. And in Minnesota, I forgot where the meetings are. They used to be at St. Cloud State. Remember in fact, St. Cloud State still has a meteorology department, but I think it's moved now. I think it's at another university. It might be, the Saturday meetings might be at Northfield now, where Carleton or St. Olaf, might be either on the St. Olaf or Carleton campuses, but I think they've moved the Saturday meetings to Northfield. So that's a good possibility to consider if you want to upgrade your own knowledge and capacity to incorporate climate and climate change in what you're teaching. So with that, I'm going to stop. I hope I have at least given you some things to think about, if not act on. And as you can tell from my speaking about this, this is a really, really important issue to me. As long as I have any speaking or cognitive ability at all, I'm going to keep in this game. I am not going to abandon this game because I really think it's important for our future. And anyway, that's where I'm coming from. Besides, NPR has said they want to keep me till I'm dead. So, what the heck? People don't often say that to you. So anyway, so thanks. If you want to share a comment or if you want to ask a question, as Noreen said, there's microphones over here on either side to share. I know it's getting kind of late, but maybe is the brain still active? Anybody have any thoughts or questions or anything about what I've presented? Go ahead.
All right. Thank you for being here. I love listening to you, and it's mostly Fridays now, right? Yeah, so thank you. I'm not a scientist, so bear with this part of that fact in my question, but when you look at the data as a climatologist, I have a class that's about to do a group case study on climate change, and they play different roles of different organizations in that. But and the data you show is compelling for Minnesota and beyond, do you connect it to does your data at some level connect to human activity clearly? I mean, is there a way I realize that I think the scientific community would say it's clear that it's driven by human activity, but is there anything in your data sets that help us connect those dots? And I'm thinking of my students.
Understood. Not so much, I would answer your question like this. I haven't been personally involved in studies that have given attribution to what happens in Minnesota. Like, for example, the $1 billion hailstorm, okay? I have not personally been involved in the study of attribution, but I know the authors who have. The American Meteorological Society, I think I alluded to this earlier today with your faculty too. The American Meteorological Society now has a team of scientists that do forensic analysis on every single weather and climate extreme in this country, especially those that lead to $1 billion in loss or greater. You can bet that those will be studied scientifically to the maximum. Yep. They come out with an annual edition of the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society that is a forensic analysis of all of those major events. Right. And our $1 billion hail disaster of August of 2023 made that list. Wow. And it was not solely attributed to climate change, but I think they said the circumstances and ingredients, oftentimes they do what they call ingredients method to look at what ingredients went in to the manufacture of an event and what was the probability that those ingredients would have been there if you didn't have climate change. Those sorts of questions. And I think something like 50% of the attribution for our $1 billion hailstorm was associated with climate change. They'll do that for Milton and Helene in terms of the hurricanes. They'll do that for the wildfires in the western states. They'll do that for the Arizona drought. They'll do that for the 25-inch thunderstorm rain at Fort Lauderdale. They'll do that for all these events will get studied and written up by that team. Good. And that's so AMS Bulletin Forensic Meteorology. All right. Year by year by year by year, those events are written up.
Good. Can I just ask one quick follow-up? So you talked about the publication that you first did in 2006 and then updated in 2015 and the huge numbers of records that were set in that time. Is somebody going to update it 9 years later now in 2024? Or
I've been begging my colleagues, my younger colleagues, to do it, but they haven't taken it on. I even volunteered that I'd help them, but because the manuscript form still exists in electronic form for both editions, edition 1 and edition 2, but the number crunching that would need to be done to update it, but I haven't been able to talk anybody into it yet. All right. And it is a lot of work.
I'm sure.
I'm a person who retired, well, it doesn't matter, I guess. I'm a person who retired at age 71 because I was worn out. I didn't have the energy to give 50 hours a week anymore. Yep. And now...
My question wasn't, are you going to do it, but just...
No, I'm trying to get somebody to take it on. I'd gladly give them the manuscript as a starting point. All right. And they could take it on and update it. Great. But
thank you. Thanks for being here.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my question is, you showed the trend line going up, And you talked about, there was that paper that talked about the variability, you know, but having a constant mean. So looking at the data for Minnesota, is the variability also going up along with the trend line?
Yes, emphatically, yes. In fact, there's a whole conference at the American Meteorological Society. We're not the only ones. In fact, you know where the concentration is? It's the Great Lakes region. So at the American Meteorological Society annual meeting, this wasn't last year, but I think 2 years ago, the state climatologists from Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, Indiana, they all showed the statistical evidence that the magnitude of variability has just blown up. So when we go warm, we really go warm. When we go cold, we really go cold. When we go wet, we really go wet. When we go dry, we really go dry. And that's partly explains why in recent years we've come up with a jargon like flash drought. Have you heard that jargon used more? That was a word invented to try to describe this amplified variability, because it used to take us months of precipitation deficiency to migrate into a full-fledged drought scenario. And now we can see that happen in relatively short periods of time, like 2 or 3 months, because with the enhanced temperature variable going on simultaneously, what we call in research evapotranspiration, or the loss of water vapor from the landscape, is so much more amplified than what it used to be that those deficits become extreme in short order rather than playing out over a long period of time. So there's been numerous, and there's been the Chinese had another dedicated national meeting to exactly that question at their last annual meeting, because in central China they're seeing the amplified climate variability as well. So this has something to do with the mid-latitude bands of the northern hemisphere and what's happening there. And so that's a very good question. I'm glad you brought that up, because there's a lot of attention being directed to that.
Mark, what might you say to a young adult who feels a little paralyzed about climate change, or about the state of affairs that faces them as they go forward in life?
Excuse me just 1 second. Oh, I should show this off, crying out loud. Hey, if you don't think a climate scientist hasn't read this, Pope Francis, come on, give us a little credit. Yeah. You know, that's a good question, Sean. One of the areas that's taken off, and Dr. Roop, my successor at the U, came out with this, I think, just last year, the Climate Action Handbook. 100 climate solutions for everyone. Pragmatism. What can I do? How about 100 different things you could do? Okay? And that book's been a bestseller for the last year. There's lots of things that you could do that would be, effective. And just the act of doing them, you're doing something profound because you're role modeling. You know what I mean? Back to what I was saying. If we could have more and more and more people do that, that would be terrific. So, and get engaged with the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership. They're always looking for partners, and so I'll talk more about that with your people tomorrow. But yeah, there's people want to take action. You don't want to just sit back and fret about it, but do something. And so those are a couple of mechanisms that can be done, can be used, and go from there. And keep having dialogue about it. Don't neglect it. You know, neglecting it or dismissing it, if it's not already evident to you, those are the two worst things to do. in our lifetime. This is, and I think I shared this, Sean, earlier with your faculty. We've evolved to a state with this pace of climate change. There's that word again, pace. We've evolved to a state now that we're living in where literally it's all hands on deck. If we don't take action now and take aggressive action now, the consequences are almost going to be incomprehensible. We've really got to, and we're capable. That's the other thing. We're capable of taking meaningful action, but we've just got to get with it and do it.
Last question.
Question, we're also hearing about particle problems in the atmosphere, CO2 in the atmosphere. Is any of that data correlated with the climate change? Like as you're looking at your statistics, are you bringing any of that other statistics of atmosphere and ozone and all of that?
Yeah, there was a good question about the particle composition in the atmosphere. There's an article that just came out this year from Stanford University that documents that especially in the northern hemisphere, I don't know about the southern hemisphere. I don't think this is an issue in the southern hemisphere. I could be wrong. But in the northern hemisphere, the Stanford article alluded to the fact that in the last decade, the incidence of wildfires has become so extreme that the particle composition of the atmosphere has changed significantly. And they've attributed this to the massive, massive amount of wildfires that have been going on in the, now we even have them in the higher latitudes where we used to not even worry about them. But now in like 55 and 60 degrees north latitude, we're even having wildfires. And of course, there's nothing done to control them up in the, up in those reaches. So, yeah, I wish I could remember the name of the author. It starts with an L, but I can't remember. If I remember the name of the author of that Stanford paper, I'll let one of the people here know, but my memory's failing me right now. So, anyway, all right, well, thank you very, very much.